The wind howls through the lion gate of Hattusa, carrying the dust of 3,000 years. The stone lions' mouths, frozen in a silent roar, still stand guard over a city that once ruled the world from the Aegean to the Euphrates. But if you listen closely to the wind, you might hear something else beneath the whistle of the air through the ruins. You might hear the clinking of bronze chains, the shuffle of thousands of weary feet, and the stifled cries of men and women whose faces have been erased by the knife. This was the Hittite Empire, the kingdom of Hatti, a superpower of the late Bronze Age that rivaled Egypt and Babylon. They gave us the earliest peace treaty in history, but they also perfected the art of state-sanctioned terror. Beneath the veneer of diplomacy and the order of their laws lay a system of punishment so calculated, so visceral, that it turned the human body itself into a billboard for imperial power. Welcome to Medieval Spirits. Today we are going to walk the path of the rebel in the Bronze Age. We will stand before the king as an oathbreaker, feel the cold bronze of the executioner's blade, and trudge the hundreds of miles of the deportation routes that reshaped the demographics of the ancient Near East. We will examine the forensic reality of mutilation not as random cruelty, but as a precise bureaucratic tool used to strip identity and enforce submission. Prepare yourself. This is not the history of glorious battles and golden chariots. This is the history of what happens when you say no to a god-king. The silence of the Anatolian steppe is deceptive, for beneath the soil lie the unmarked graves of those who learned too late that the mercy of Hatti was as sharp and unyielding as obsidian. In the late Bronze Age, the Hittite Empire stood as one of the great powers of the Near East, ruling vast lands from their capital at Hattusa. Yet, beneath the administrative order and diplomatic treaties, the Hittites maintained a policy of calculated brutality against those who defied their rule. When provincial governors reported uprisings or border cities broke their oaths of loyalty, Hittite retribution was swift and merciless. Contemporary cuneiform tablets inscribed in Akkadian and Hittite record punishments that went far beyond simple execution. Rebels and captured soldiers were frequently subjected to disfiguring punishments, such as the removal of ears, noses, or hands, intended not only as retribution, but as a lasting symbol of disgrace. In some cases, the blinded or disfigured prisoners were sent back to their home cities, living symbols of the consequences of resistance. This was not an impulsive cruelty, but a deliberate tool of imperial control. The Hittite legal codes, preserved in fragments on clay, did not prescribe such mutilations for ordinary crimes, suggesting that these acts were reserved for political and military defiance. In this way, the state blurred the line between battlefield justice and psychological warfare. The practice also carried a symbolic weight. In Hittite culture, the human face was bound to identity and honor. To disfigure it, it was to erase dignity, rendering the victim a permanent testament to the empire's reach. This method was not unique to the Hittites. Other Near Eastern empires practiced similar punishments. But within Hatti, it formed part of a broader system of fear paired with mass deportations, public executions, and the destruction of sacred places. In this way, the Hittites maintained order not just by sword and chariot, but by reshaping the human body into a tool of imperial propaganda. The psychological impact of facial mutilation in the ancient world cannot be overstated. The nose was seen as the organ of breath and life. To cut it off was to symbolically suffocate the person's social existence. A man without a nose or ears was marked forever as a traitor, a walking cautionary tale who could never hide his shame. He became a pariah, excluded from temples and public assemblies, his very presence a pollution to the community. The Hittites understood that killing a rebel ended his suffering, but disfiguring him prolonged the lesson for decades. Every time he walked through the market, every time he tried to drink or eat, the scar tissue reminded everyone watching, this is the price of defiance. In the medical context of the Bronze Age, surviving such a procedure was a gruesome lottery. Without antibiotics or anesthesia, the risk of infection was incredibly high. The procedure, likely performed with a bronze knife or a heated iron to cauterize the wound, would have been agonizing. The sheer trauma could send a victim into shock, yet the intent was survival, not death. The executioners were skilled enough to maim without killing, ensuring the victim lived long enough to serve their purpose as a living monument to the king's wrath. The executioner's blade was not just a tool of punishment, but a sculptor's chisel carving the king's authority directly into the flesh of his subjects. A corpse displayed above the city gates spoke louder than any royal decree. While impalement itself is not explicitly attested in surviving Hittite texts, other Near Eastern powers, most notoriously, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, used the gruesome act as a form of psychological warfare. In the context of the Hittites, the historical record shows they shared the underlying principle. Punishments were staged in highly visible ritualized ways, ensuring that the fate of rebels was both public and enduring. The fortified walls of Hattusa, known as the imperial heart of the kingdom of Hatti, were more than defensive structures. They were symbols of divine and royal authority. When a rebellious city was taken, whether in Anatolia, northern Syria, or the upper Euphrates, the Hittites often brought captured leaders to the gates or walls, where their punishment could be witnessed by the assembled population. Surviving texts from the reigns of kings, such as Suppiluliuma I and Muwatalli II, describe the binding of traitors before the gods or in the presence of the army, sometimes followed by execution or mutilation. These punishments were not spontaneous acts of vengeance. They were part of a calculated, ritualized process in which justice was presented as an extension of divine will. The king, acting as the earthly agent of the storm god of Hatti, could order a public killing or symbolic humiliation. This could involve suspending a body from the city gates, placing decapitated heads on display, or keeping prisoners publicly restrained until death. The point was not merely to end a life, but to transform the body into a warning and object lesson to the living. The use of city walls as a stage for punishment had deep cultural resonance. Walls define the sacred boundary between the ordered world inside and the chaos beyond. To die upon them or be displayed, there was to be cast permanently outside the community's protection. For conquered peoples, seeing the bodies of their leaders exposed against the sky made the empire's dominance tangible. The sight of a once powerful king or general stripped of his finery and reduced to rotting meat for the vultures shattered the morale of the resistance. It broke the spell of their authority and replaced it with the undeniable reality of Hittite supremacy. The stench of decay drifting down from the ramparts served as an olfactory reminder to every citizen entering the city that the king's reach extended even beyond the grave. Though the Hittites may not have practiced impalement in the same manner as the Assyrians, their approach achieved the same end. The visible destruction of an enemy's body as a public proclamation of Hittite authority. The walls became not just barriers of stone, but billboards of fear, reminders that rebellion was not only futile, but would be repaid in a manner designed to linger in collective memory. But the punishment of the individual was often just the prelude to the punishment of the collective. When the armies of the Hittite Empire, known as the Kingdom of Hatti, subdued a rebellious city, the victory was rarely followed by leniency. One of the most far-reaching punishments in their arsenal was mass deportation, a policy designed to dismantle resistance at its roots. Entire populations could be uprooted from their ancestral lands, marched across mountains and plains, and resettled in distant provinces under imperial control. These people were known in Hittite texts as NAM, civilian captives. Cuneiform tablets from Hattusa, especially from the reigns of Suppiluliuma I and Hattusili III record such transfers in meticulous detail. Skilled artisans, scribes, and soldiers were often separated from the general population and sent to serve the empire's needs, while the rest were dispersed among rural settlements far from their original homes. This not only weakened the political cohesion of the conquered region, but also ensured that the memory of rebellion was diluted through forced assimilation. The deportation process itself was a severe ordeal. Those who resisted, whether attempting to flee, hide, or fight back, could face swift and public consequences. Resistance during the march was met with immediate and severe consequences. Rebel leaders were eliminated publicly, families forcibly separated, and individuals subjected to punishments akin to those inflicted on battlefield captives. Imagine the scene: thousands of people clutching their meager possessions, herded like cattle by armed guards. The old and the sick who could not keep up were likely left to die by the roadside or dispatched to save resources. It was a death march disguised as relocation. The roads of Anatolia were paved not with stone, but with the footprints of the displaced, a trail of tears that stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the Black Sea. In certain cases, the Hittite military might burn homes and fields before departure, leaving nothing to return to. These mass relocations were not framed solely as acts of cruelty. Hittite inscriptions sometimes portrayed them as the ordering of a chaotic land carried out under divine sanction. Yet for the displaced, the reality was one of cultural erasure. Temples, family tombs, and local shrines were left behind, sometimes deliberately destroyed to sever the spiritual and ancestral bonds that tied people to their homeland. The Hittites literally stole the gods of the conquered peoples, taking their statues back to Hattusa to be held hostage in the imperial temples. Without their gods and without their land, the people ceased to exist as a distinct entity. Strategically, deportations allowed the Hittites to repopulate strategic border zones, strengthen loyal territories with new labor, and strip rebellious regions of the manpower needed for future uprisings. Socially, they fractured communal identities, replacing them with dependence on the imperial system. The message was clear: rebellion did not end at the moment of defeat. Its consequences could span generations, with an entire people scattered and redefined under the shadow of Hattie's authority. The NAMRA became a new social class, neither fully slave nor fully free, living in a limbo of enforced servitude. They were the fuel that kept the Hittite economy burning, but they were also a constant source of potential unrest, requiring ever more vigilant policing. Conquest in the Hittite Empire did not always end with execution or exile. For many captives, survival meant a life of relentless toil under imperial control. Forced labor was a critical element of the Hittite state, supplying manpower for monumental building projects, agricultural production, and military logistics. It was also a form of punishment, ensuring that those who had once resisted the empire would now serve it through their labor. Royal annals and treaty texts attest to the large-scale relocation of prisoners of war into labor camps or frontier settlements. These captives might be assigned to quarry stone for the massive walls of Hattusa, dig irrigation channels in newly conquered territories, or haul timber from distant mountain regions. The massive limestone blocks of the capital, some weighing ton, were likely moved into place by the straining muscles of men who had once fought to destroy the very king they were now building a palace for. Others served as porters, carrying military supplies across hundreds of kilometers of rugged terrain during campaigns. The marches themselves were a grueling ordeal. Captives were often driven on foot for weeks or months, chained together and guarded by soldiers. They traversed the varied and unforgiving landscapes of Anatolia mountain passes, swept by cold winds, arid plateaus, where water was scarce, and dense forests where progress was slow. The Hittites planned these relocations for strategic reasons, but for the captives, the journey was itself a form of attrition. The logistical challenge of moving thousands of people was immense, and the Hittites developed a sophisticated bureaucracy to manage it. Scribes counted the captives, allocated rations, and recorded deaths with cold efficiency. Once at their destination, working conditions were harsh and unrelenting. Laborers toiled from sunrise to sunset with minimal rest and poor rations, often little more than bread, porridge, and water. In the hot summers, quarry and field workers faced dehydration and heat exhaustion. In winter, exposure to freezing winds and snow was common. Injuries from heavy lifting accidents with tools and untreated illness could be fatal. These conditions served both practical and psychological purposes. The empire benefited from the labor output, while the physical exhaustion and harsh environment broke the spirit of those who might otherwise resist. It is hard to imagine the daily reality of these labor camps. The sound of the overseer's lash, the constant gnawing of hunger, the despair of knowing you would never see your home again. Skilled captives such as metal workers or stonemasons were kept under closer supervision, often working in guarded compounds to prevent escape or sabotage. The Hittites valued their skills, but they feared their knowledge. A smith who could forge a sword could also forge a weapon for a rebellion. Thus, they were watched constantly, their talents exploited for the glory of the king. Through forced labor marches and the grueling life that followed, the Hittite state transformed its enemies into the very hands that built its cities, supplied its armies, and sustained its economy, an enduring reminder that Hittite conquest did not end at the battlefield. The beautiful reliefs of Hattusa depicting gods and kings in procession were carved by hands that may have been branded as property of the state, a silent irony hidden in the stone. It continued with every stone lifted, every furrow dug, and every weary step across its vast and demanding lands. The systematic erasure of the enemy was not just physical, it was spiritual. By destroying the temples and seizing the gods of the conquered cities, the Hittites committed a form of theocide. They demonstrated that the local gods were powerless to protect their people against the storm god of Hatti. This religious warfare broke the psychological resistance of the population. If your god could be captured and taken away in a cart, what hope did you have? The treaties the Hittites forced upon their vassals, the famous suzerainty treaties, contained elaborate curse clauses. If a vassal broke his oath, he invited a horrific list of divine punishments upon himself: blindness, deafness, infertility, plague, and annihilation. These were not empty threats. When a rebellion occurred, the Hittites viewed the subsequent punishment not just as state policy, but as the fulfillment of these curses. The mutilation of rebels was the physical enactment of the oath-breaking curse. By blinding a traitor, the king was merely acting as the instrument of the gods who had been sworn to witness the treaty. An empire held by fear reshaped maps and memory bodies, marked gods, seized peoples, uprooted cities, stripped of their sanctuaries, captives, driven to exhaust the frontiers. The Hittites turned punishment into policy and visibility into power, proof that law can become an instrument of erasure. The legacy of this brutality is etched into the landscape of Anatolia. The ruins of Hattusa are vast and imposing, but they are also silent. The voices of the thousands of NAM. The deported peoples who lived and died in the shadow of those walls are lost to history. We only know of them through the cold administrative lists of the scribes. The clay tablets that recorded their rations are the only tombstones they were ever given a bureaucratic record of lives spent like copper coins. Today we look back at the Hittite Empire with a mixture of awe and horror. We admire their diplomatic skills, their military prowess, and their architectural achievements. But we must also recognize the cost of that power. The stability of the Pax Hithitica, the Hittite peace, was built on a foundation of terror. It was a peace maintained by the threat of the knife, the chain, and the long march into exile. The Hittites showed us that civilization and barbarism are not opposites. Sometimes they are the same thing, just viewed from different sides of the city wall. Which measure mutilation, display, deportation, temple seizure, or forced labor most crushed resistance? And why was it the physical pain of the knife or the existential dread of being erased from your homeland? Perhaps it was the combination of all of them, a total assault on the body, mind, and soul of the rebel. Comment below. As the Hittite laws state, he shall cut off the slave's nose and ears, and they will give him back to his house. This law, preserved for 3 millennia, reminds us that in the ancient world, justice was often just another word for vengeance. If you want to uncover more of the hidden dark history of the ancient world, subscribe to Medieval Spirits. We dig up the bones of history to find the truth buried beneath the lies. Let's continue exploring history together. There are countless stories still waiting to be uncovered in the end. The Hittite Empire crumbled into dust, but the scars they carved into the history of the Near East remained a testament to the terrifying efficiency of their imperial machine.